1 in 6 couples cannot conceive. And unfortunately, that percentage is even higher here in the United States. But what if I were to tell you that with full acknowledgement of how heart-wrenching it can be for the people involved, ultimately, infertility is often the first visible sign of a deeper multi-system dysfunction and not just a reproductive issue. We're not ultimately facing just a fertility crisis, but a collapse of biological resilience, if you will. And as practitioners, often we're missing this larger forest for the ovaries. Welcome to Functional Medicine for Real World Impact, where we're diving into the complex, interconnected nature of health and disease, exploring not just theory, but practically what it takes to turn functional medicine insight into powerful, practical, real-world results. So please hit subscribe and let's get started. This is Tracy Harrison from the School of Applied Functional Medicine, and I'm excited to share today some clinical wisdom and insight for all practitioners. I'm going to share with you 5 common functional imbalances that are at play in your patients and clients who are wrestling with infertility or who are worried about the possibility of future infertility, and how you can be more alert and focused in your clinical efforts in order to make sure that they ultimately achieve their goals. First of all, I want to dive right in and talk about the first and I believe the most common imbalance that is at play, which is insulin resistance and blood sugar imbalance. Indeed, we know that type 2 diabetes is not only an epidemic status in the U.S. and in many other countries in the Western world right now, but especially if we're looking further upstream at the earlier stages of metabolic dysfunction, well before we start to see blood sugar elevate. Much less be able to officially diagnose prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, we find a much larger, alarmingly larger community of both men and women wrestling in particular with the early stages of hyperinsulinemia. So often we think that metabolic dysregulation is maybe not critical enough or not causing enough dysfunction in the body to respond until we start to see blood sugar slowly creep up. Hemoglobin A1C, 5.7, 5.9, 6.2. Especially in the conventional medical world, this is often the threshold for beginning to take action. But as practitioners, we can do much better by taking a look at fasting insulin and fasting C-peptide. I believe actually one of these two markers should be run on every adult in your practice, because even progressive subclinical elevations in insulin over time can be promoting infertility. Hyperinsulinemia actually stimulates higher levels of androgen, male hormone production in the ovaries. And this can lead to disrupted ovulation, maybe overt anovulatory cycles, which is what we often see in what we call PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a little bit of an unfortunate, or I think misleading name. Ultimately, it is a sign of an androgen dominant dynamic in a woman that is overtly promoting infertility. And this can be happening behind the scenes well before blood sugar is alarming in any way. In fact, in the early stages of metabolic dysfunction, because fasting insulin is creeping up, people often struggle more with episodes of hypoglycemia for many years before pancreatic dysfunction starts to render a progressive increase in blood sugar. So we want to be looking for hyperinsulinemia, even subclinically. I would say at least the entire upper half of the normal range is an indication that we need to be looking at what might be promoting this adaptive, aggressive response from the pancreas. And usually this is an effort to try to proactively accommodate a higher glycemic load of life. And for the average person, this is about looking at both their diet as well as their stress. Because after all, completely separate from diet, higher levels of stress hormones, whether it's progressively higher levels of cortisol or higher levels or more frequent surges of norepinephrine or epinephrine, both of those work to increase blood sugar, completely separate from diet. And for a lot of people in your practice who have a seemingly perfect diet, a good low glycemic a diet, appropriate intake of carbohydrates, it still might be the stressors in their life that is leading to this higher glycemic load. And often these are stressors we overlook. It may not be trauma or crisis or death or grief. It might be a lot of what people would consider to be positive excitement, workaholism, the job you love, a really aggressive project. Sometimes it can be people just taking on way too much activity and projects and commitments and people pleasing. It can also be hidden physiological stressors like sleep apnea or toxic overload, or a chronic simmering infectious dynamic in the body like high viral load or dysbiosis in the gut. But either way, we want to be remembering that all hormones are interacting together in our body, in a soup, if you will, and that elevated insulin has a direct impact on sex hormones. In particular, it tends to downregulate sex hormone binding globulin. So not only are we getting higher levels of androgens in a woman's body, but more of those are free or unbound, and therefore available to have, in this case, more insidious effects that might be directly impairing ovulation. So look for this. In particular, measure fasting C-peptide, ideally, or fasting insulin, so you can understand where this might be at play in your practice. That's number one. And if you're enjoying what you're hearing, I do want to encourage you to remember to subscribe so that you can gain this additional clinical wisdom on a regular basis. The second functional imbalance I want to speak of is estrogen dominance. Now, this one is the one that is perhaps more well understood, especially in the realm of integrative medicine or functional medicine. And estrogen dominance often has hallmark symptoms such as really debilitating menstrual periods, highly symptomatic PMS symptoms, cramping, bloating, anxiety, poor sleep, migraines, this type of thing, maybe very heavy menstrual bleeding with a lot of blood loss. A lot of these women struggle with anemia, perhaps passing clots. And we know that there can be challenges with regard to estrogen metabolism. At the end of the day, very few women actually have estrogen dominance because of ovaries gone wild, if you will. Instead, we may have a more normal, a more typical synthesis of innate human estrogens, but what we struggle with is impaired biotransformation or metabolism and clearance of those estrogens so that they simply build up in the body. And this is where nutrition is really essential for looking at the biotransformation or detox pathways in the body, and in particular the phase 2 detox pathways that can be constrained by genetics, by nutrient deficiencies, by phytonutrient imbalances where we're not stimulating some of these pathways enough. But we want to think about in particular methylation, glucuronidation, sulfation. These are pathways that we need to be active and flexible and well-fueled in order to metabolize estrogen through its progressive stages to ensure that we don't end up with excessive estrogenic effects. And of course, having low progesterone because of anovulatory cycles or just poor progesterone synthesis, what I would call partial ovulation, as I mentioned in the beginning, can be a driver here as well. But what I want to emphasize clinically today is an area of investigation or intervention that I find is often overlooked by practitioners. And that is delving into a unique person's exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals. They are rampant. There are thousands and thousands of chemicals in common modern use today in our cultural meme of better living through chemistry that are actually strongly, not mildly, but strongly potentiating the effects of estrogen. And endocrine disrupting chemicals can affect a variety of different hormones, but estrogenic effects are especially insidious because they can indeed create excessive estrogenic effects completely on top of, or in some cases completely separate from, endogenous human estrogens. A woman can actually have relatively low levels of her own human estrogens. But if she is exposed daily, especially to numerous endocrine disrupting chemicals, which can have synergistic exponential effects, her net estrogenic response in her body might be quite aggressive. And we want to think about personal hygiene and beauty products, household cleaning products, exposure in the diet to pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, exposure to heavy metals such as mercury in silver amalgam dental fillings, exposure to glyphosate residues, which is really rampant in some targeted crops that we may not choose to purchase in organic forms. There are so many different types of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and we really need to do an inventory of these in order to understand where we can coach and support our patients and clients to make better health promoting, hormone balance promoting, and yes, fertility promoting choices. This is an essential and often overlooked area of clinical practice where we got to be willing to get in the ditch, get in the detail with each unique patient and client and help them to find where these lurk in their lifestyle, but also help them to identify and source and make choices for better products in their life. And so this is something we want to be thinking carefully about. Endocrine disrupting chemicals can actually mimic estrogen. They can make the behavior of estrogen receptors more or less sensitive or sticky, if you will, or they can modify the activity, the synthesis and the activity of the enzymes that are involved in estrogen metabolism. And keep in mind, these are chemicals that won't be measured on hormone tests, which is why we always want to be assessing and supporting the patient based on their full, complete presentation, not just through the limited lens of their labs. Because, as I said, some people have seemingly optimal lab values, but their qualitative presentation makes it quite clear that they are indeed struggling from hormone imbalance and especially estrogen dominance. So that's the second one you want to be sure to look for and to do a good thorough symptom assessment to understand where estrogenic overload might actually be promoting infertility. The third functional imbalance I want to talk about is the gut. And we often overlook the gut because it seems far distant from the ovaries or from the testes. But because the gut ultimately is involved in so much of our immune system regulation, the gut ends up being the gatekeeper of hormone balance and actually of reproductive immunity. Many people in your practices are struggling with loss of barrier function in the gut, what we often call leaky gut, or more accurately, physiologically, enhanced intestinal permeability, where microbial debris and inflammatory mediators like cytokines can end up getting excessive exposure to our gut-associated lymphatic tissue and the basement membrane of our intestines in particular, and even greater infiltration into systemic circulation. And the immune system will tolerate a lot of pro-inflammatory substances, biochemicals in the gut. But as soon as we lose this barrier function in the gut, and we end up with higher systemic levels of these circulating gut-based biochemicals, we end up with higher systemic inflammation. And this can have a direct impact specifically on the success of implantation for pregnancy in a high inflammatory state. It makes sense that through the body's wisdom, this probably doesn't seem like a good positive possibility for successful pregnancy. Indeed, I'm going to talk more in a moment about stress and inflammation are two key drivers for infertility. We want to seek pregnancy and actually achieve pregnancy from a place of strength, from a place of relative balance, as a way of better ensuring that we don't just conceive, but we actually are able to see through a positive, successful full-term pregnancy by minimizing the likelihood of miscarriage or other complications. And so we want to take care of the gut and ensure that we are well supporting good microbial balance. A key major mediator of loss of barrier function in the intestines is dysbiosis. This is a common occurrence because of stress-related immunosuppression that allows opportunistic overgrowths in the gut that can alarm the immune system and increase inflammation. It can also result from medications that we take, especially frequent courses of antibiotics that are purposefully suppressing competition and encouraging the overgrowth of less vulnerable species. That again, immune system reactivity, lots of oxidative stress and pro-oxidant secretions from our immune system can be wreaking havoc on the gut. So a wonderful clinical recommendation is that if you want to seek pregnancy, take care of optimizing gut function first, because we want to minimize the likelihood of gut-mediated systemic inflammation. Ultimately, infertility may actually be thought of accurately as a GI terrain issue, maybe masked as a hormonal disorder. And this can potentially be a real game changer for long-term success, not just of conception, but also sustained successful pregnancy and birth. Now, the fourth pearl I want to talk about, this functional imbalance that is often at play, is indeed toxicity. And this probably doesn't surprise you. This has been much better researched in the realm of even conventional drivers for infertility. And indeed, as I said earlier, a lot of toxins are using molecular mimicry to wreak havoc on our hormone balance. And this is also promoting dysregulation in the HPA-TG axis in our overall endocrine system. And so building on what I was talking about earlier, it's not just a matter of endocrine-disrupting chemicals like BPA, bisphenol A, that we get from the lining of lots of cans that contain food, or that is used as a coating on the back of cash register receipts in order to help it to be a slippery, non-stick surface. Despite the fact that a lot of the hubbub has died down, BPA is in wider than ever use. But even other things like phthalates and parabens, which are incredibly common in makeup and hair color and nail polish and all sorts of potions and serums and salves and ointments that we put on our body. Sunscreen, typical national brand sunscreen is loaded with estrogen mimicking chemicals. But it even goes beyond that, because even the chemicals that are not actually promoting hormonal imbalance, what they ultimately are going to do is be creating in time an overload on our detoxification capacity, right? Toxic overload only happens when our toxic exposure overloads our toxic clearance capacity. And when we're exposed to way too many toxins way too frequently, We can overburden our pathways that would otherwise help us to readily excrete what we're exposed to. And increasingly, toxic overload is a problem. And what the body can't biodegrade in multi-stage detoxification and clear, it tends to store in the body. And in particular, adipose tissue is a very common storage spot for toxins. Many different chemicals in common commercial use today are lipophilic. We store them in our belly fat. We store them in our brain. Some other chemicals like lead, for example, are preferentially stored in bone. But this ends up being a major issue because while the body is trying to store these chemicals away from active circulation, they are still promoting localized oxidative stress and damage and localized inflammation that can then have systemic effects. And an awful lot of miscarriage. Maybe there's an initial conception and successful pregnancy, but miscarriage is really quite common in individuals who have redox imbalance, meaning their antioxidant capacity is not significant enough to help them to counter the pro-oxidant impact of our overall life system. Oh, and we have pro-oxidant demand from just living and breathing on a regular basis, right? Cellular respiration in our mitochondria generates free radicals. So we have to have good, well-supported endogenous antioxidant capacity. And a lot of people in your practices don't have that. They don't have that because they don't eat a rich variety of fruits and vegetables that have phytonutrients that would stimulate those pathways. They don't have that because they have other dynamics in their life that are promoting lots of oxidative stress and damage, like COVID, long COVID, high circulating levels of spike protein or spike protein fragments that might come from a COVID illness or from mRNA vaccinations. They might have higher levels of oxidative stress or damage as I said, because of toxicity. And this is a simmering dynamic we really want to pay attention to. And again, do the toxic inventory, but also assess antioxidant pathways in the body. And in particular, think about methylation, which is essential biochemical conversion to support glutathione. Assess glutathione. Make sure that these pathways are well supported with nutrients so that even while we're removing an overload of toxic load or toxic burden from just normal, typical lifestyle choices, especially here in the U.S., we can be countering the effects of toxicity with good, strong antioxidant capacity. Now, the fifth, and I believe perhaps the most important and maybe most insidious functional imbalance that we need to talk about related to infertility is adrenal thyroid imbalance. Subclinical hypothyroidism is rampant and it does promote infertility. And we're not typically going to find this, in particular, this subclinical imbalance if all we're looking at to gauge thyroid function is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. I know that's a long-standing myth, but I can't tell you the number of times with the thousands of cases we've looked at SAFM over the years that we have seen TSH not only be normal, maybe seemingly optimal, but when you actually assess and look at free T4 and even free T3 thyroid hormone, either or both of them might be suboptimal or might actually be clinically low. Even with a perfect TSH, there are a lot of practitioners who don't believe this is possible, and I have literally seen it hundreds of times because of so many of the idiosyncrasies of how the adrenal thyroid axis works. And the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary may be quite satisfied with its intracellular thyroid hormone effects. And so TSH remains fairly low, but other tissue like the liver, like the kidneys, like the brain, like the ovaries might be still struggling with a hypothyroid state. And this is much more common than you might think. And so we want to run a full thyroid panel, not just TSH, but also at least free T4 and free T3. Ideally, you check reverse T3 as well, and also both thyroid peroxidase and thyroglobulin antibodies. Again, another common myth, it is not enough to just measure one or the other. Very commonly, only one of them is substantially elevated. And depending on what people are going through, right? Again, they might be on the other side of a really stressful period of their life, or on the other side of a marked gut dysbiosis, or on the other side of COVID. And an autoimmune dynamic can develop, can appear. So it's not enough to assess this only once in a person's adult life. But the other side of the equation is stress. And stress is a major challenge, not only because it's creating higher glycemic load and maybe metabolic dysregulation, which was the first thing I covered, but stress can also be promoting lower levels of progesterone, which can promote estrogen dominance, which is the second dynamic I mentioned. And high levels of stress is immunosuppressive and can be creating gut imbalances, promoting dysbiosis, which is the third thing I mentioned. And certainly when we feel stressed, we can dive into a lot of activities, lifestyle choices that are quite toxic, especially with higher intake of highly processed foods, maybe higher levels of alcohol. We don't take good care of ourselves. So don't marginalize stress as a major mediator of infertility, and that we've got to get in the weeds on the nuances of stressors and how they might be promoting infertility behind the scenes. We can assess things like cortisol levels and cortisol metabolism, but it's really important that we help to teach people that you're not hiding your physiology or biochemistry, and you're certainly not hiding from your ovaries the real state of your stress and whether your unique body believes now is an ideal time, a safe time, a likely successful time to conceive and reproduce and bring another wonderful soul into the world. So I hope this has been of support for you. Please don't forget to subscribe. You can also turn on alerts in Facebook or YouTube in order to catch these sessions live via notifications. But I thank you for joining us, and I look forward to being with you next time. Have a great day.